A series on the fruits of the Spirit, as described in the reading we heard from Colossians. And it is my good fortune, and maybe your misfortune, that I'm starting with love. I just say those wonderful verses again. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Now, I'm fairly confident that if I asked all of you to give me a definition of love, I would receive a very wide variety of answers. It's a short word with so many meanings to so many different people. If we think of love in the context of our families, most would easily recognize the meaning of love in that context, wouldn't they? Just seeing grandma or granddad with a grandchild tells you everything you need to know about family love, how truly precious it is for both parties. Just think of a love between a devoted husband and devoted wife, whether they are in their 20s or in their 80s. And this story, I think, illustrates that so well. A chap called Cecil Northcott finds a wheelbarrow containing two very clean-looking pillows parked outside a remote dispensary. In due time, the dispensary door opened, and out came a woman limping very painfully, helped along by her husband. He led her gently towards the wheelbarrow. I got up and smoothed the pillows and held the wheelbarrow steady while he lifted her in. It was a tender, moving sight to see this gaunt African slowly lifting his sick wife into the wheelbarrow where she curled up in comfort on the pillows. Then proudly lifting the handles of the wheelbarrow, he looked all around, at the doctor in the dispensary, at me and the waiting crowd, and wheeled away his homemade ambulance into the bush. "That's a miracle for you," said the doctor as we watched them disappear. "That man cares enough for his sick wife to wheel her in his wheelbarrow for 20 miles. He's been here before. He will come again and again and again until she's better." Now, Christians believe that God made us because he loves us, and of course he wants us to love him in return. Now, love is the subject of countless songs. As you can tell, I'm fairly elderly, so I'm going back a while here with some of these. "Can't Buy Me Love" by the Beatles. "Love is a Many Splendid Thing." I think that was Nat King Cole, wasn't it? "I Want to Know What Love Is." Who was that by? Right. Okay, I thought somebody would know. "All You Need Is Love." I think that was the Beatles, and I can remember when it was on Top of the Pops, they sang it along with the Stones, if I remember correctly. But there are many, many more like that. Loads of songs about love. And then think of all the romantic love story films. Books, plays, and pieces of art. Falling in love obviously affects our body chemistry. Love stimulates the part of our brain associated with pleasure. But love is much deeper than just good feelings. Christians believe that God is the true source of love, and he is the embodiment of it. In 1 John it says, "God is love, and love comes from God." Love is about a deep and strong commitment which goes beyond feelings. It is immensely powerful. As we heard from the Song of Songs, love burns like a blazing fire, like a mighty flame. Many waters cannot quench love. Just think of the passage from 1 Corinthians, often read at weddings. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. And might I suggest that all of us sometime just go through those various aspects from 1 Corinthians and say, how do I measure up with the people around me? Am I ever impatient? Am I ever unkind? Am I sometimes envious? Do I boast about my accomplishments? Am I rude? Am I easily angered? Do I always trust? Do I always protect those I love? Do I always hope, or do I sometimes go into despair? When you hear this at weddings, it's really encouraging for them. But the reality is you have to fulfill those things in real life, and they're not always easy. And sometimes, sadly, we fail. But always forgive, and always be prepared to receive forgiveness. And in Ephesians, we see God's love shown through Jesus Christ. Paul prays that believers will have the power to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. I always think it's a wonderful way of expressing it. Christians believe a good way to understand Jesus' love is just to read about his life, what he did, and see how he spent time with the poor, the outcasts, and the deprived. His love was really practical. He healed sick people, some of whom no one else would even go near. He told stories to illustrate God's love for all people, the good and the bad, the lovable and the not so lovable. And if we're really honest with ourselves, there will be times when even some of you might be unlovable. I know I am, so I can't think I'm the only one here. In what most of the world would view as our comfortable lives, I believe we need to remember that the heart of Christianity is sacrificial love, and something we often struggle with. Sometimes they talk about sacrificial giving, but it's also using of your time and what gifts you may have. Giving sacrificially means doing something instead of doing something you may want to do. Some people make extraordinary sacrifices for others. In wartime, a soldier might be prepared to die to protect his comrade. You hear of people who see a child about to be hit by a car, jump in the way, push the child out of the way, and die themselves. And Jesus Christ also told us we need to love our enemies and to pray for them. How many times do all of us do that? He pointed out that it's very easy to love people who love us, but the real challenge is to love those who may hate us. And of course, we saw that when Jesus gave up his life for us, when he was executed on the cross, taking the punishment due to all people for their sins. In Romans it says, Christ died for the ungodly. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. If you really think deeply about that, that's incredibly humbling. And I think that still applies so much today to you and to me individually. You will not find a greater example of love than what Jesus did for you on the cross. For God sent his own Son to die to give all people the chance to have a relationship with the Father. John's Gospel says, doesn't it? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. And in the same book, Jesus tells his followers, greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. And as we heard from today's gospel reading, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. If ever our world in recent times needs the love of God shown through Jesus Christ, it has to be now, doesn't it? We begin to hear, sadly, the drums of war that many of us thought were over in 1945. What we are witnessing in the Ukraine and in many other countries is truly frightening. In our leafy, safe sanctuary of East Devon, it is almost impossible to imagine the horrors that are taking place. One result is that we may be in danger of tarring all Russians as being the same as Putin. And it is hard not to think ill of the Russian people when you see what they're doing in Ukraine. But they are the same as you and me, but are caught up in a conflict, probably for most of them not of their choosing. And I'm reminded of some of the emotions people are feeling now when I read this piece to you. I hope it strikes home as it did to me. In 1941, Mama took me back to Moscow. There I saw our enemy for the first time. If my memory is right, nearly 20,000 German prisoners of war were to be marched in a single column through the streets of Moscow. The pavements swarmed with onlookers, cordoned off by soldiers and police. The crowd were mostly women, Russian women with hands roughened by hard work, lips untouched by lipstick, and thin, hunched soldiers which had borne half the burden of the war. Every one of them must have had a father or husband or brother or a son killed by the Germans. They gazed with hatred in the direction from which the column was to appear, and at last we saw it coming. The German generals marched at the head, massive chins stuck out, lips folded disdainfully, their whole demeanor meant to show superiority over their plebeian victors. The women were clenching their fists. The soldiers and policemen had all they could do to hold them back. But all at once something happened to them. They saw German soldiers, thin, unshaven, wearing dirty, blood-stained bandages, hobbling on crutches or leaning on the shoulders of their comrades. The soldiers walked with their heads down. The street suddenly became dead silent. The only sound was the shuffling of boots and the thumping of the crutches. Then I saw an elderly woman in broken down boots push herself forward and touch a policeman's shoulder, saying, "Let me through, please." There must have been something about her that made him step aside. She went up to the column, took from inside her coat something wrapped in a coloured handkerchief, and unfolded it. It was just a crust of black bread. She pushed it awkwardly into the pocket of a soldier, so exhausted that he was tottering on his feet. And now suddenly from every side, women were running towards these German soldiers, pushing into their hands bread, cigarettes, or whatever they had. Because the soldiers were no longer enemies, they were just people. I found that incredibly moving story, and I think we ought to think deeply about how we feel about Russia and the people who live there, and differentiate that from what is being done in their name. Because I believe that story sends us a message about love, and Christian love specifically. We must never allow hatred to become our default position, whether it is because we have a difficult neighbor or an aggressive dictatorship threatening us. Because remember that if you have an unpleasant neighbor, the odds are that he does too. For us today, the fruit of the Spirit, called love, demands of us just that, to love one another, including those whom we may not like, or whom we might even feel, we may even detest them. Through how we show that love, others may see the real Jesus living through us, and then perhaps even radically changing other people's lives through God's amazing grace. And I pray that it may indeed be so. Amen.